What would you do if you saw a helpless dog tied up in the middle of the road with a massive truck speeding toward it? Would you risk everything to save it? This is the story of a dog left to a cruel fate and the person who refused to let it happen. Nathan Carter had never considered himself a hero. He lived a quiet life, working long hours at the auto shop and keeping mostly to himself. His world consisted of oil-stained hands, the smell of gasoline, and the rhythmic sound of wrenches turning. It wasn't that he disliked people, he just preferred the silence of his garage to the chaos of the outside world. But on this particular evening, fate had different plans. Nathan had finished a late shift and was driving home when he spotted something unusual near the old iron bridge on the outskirts of town. At first, he thought it was just a pile of discarded clothes, but as his headlights illuminated the scene, a sick feeling settled in his gut. It wasn't clothes. It was a dog. The animal was barely moving, its thin body sprawled against the metal railing. A thick, frayed rope was wrapped tightly around its neck, tied cruelly to one of the bridge's rusting posts. Nathan slammed on the brakes. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Getting involved meant responsibility. It meant time, effort, and emotions, things he had learned to avoid. But then the dog's eyes opened. They were dull, unfocused, but filled with something that gripped Nathan's chest like a vice pain, fear, and the last flickering ember of hope. Cursing under his breath, he threw his truck into park and jumped out. The dog was in worse shape than he had first thought. The rope had cut deep into its flesh. Dried blood crusted around the raw wound. Its ribs jutted out sharply, a sign of starvation. The dog barely reacted as Nathan knelt beside it, only letting out a weak, rattling breath. "Hey, buddy," Nathan murmured, his voice softer than he intended. "I got you." His hands moved carefully, testing the rope. It was twisted tight, biting into the dog's fur. There was no way he could untie it. He needed a knife. Running back to his truck, he grabbed a box cutter and rushed back. The dog whimpered as he began sawing through the thick rope, but it didn't resist. It was too weak to fight. As the last fibers gave way, the rope fell to the ground, but the dog didn't move. It simply lay there, shivering. Nathan knew he couldn't leave it. Lifting the dog gently, he carried it to his truck, placing it on the passenger seat. The weight in his arms was lighter than it should have been, far too light for a dog its size. "Hang in there," he muttered as he started the engine. He didn't know much about medical care, but he knew someone who did. Dr. Evelyn Hayes, the town's best veterinarian. As he pulled onto the highway, Nathan glanced at the dog beside him. Its breathing was shallow, and its body trembled with every bump in the road. "You're not dying tonight," he said, gripping the wheel tighter. He pressed the gas pedal a little harder. The race to save Echo had begun. Nathan's truck roared through the quiet roads, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The town had mostly gone to sleep, but for him, the night had just begun. He glanced over at the dog, still curled on the passenger seat, its breathing shallow and unsteady. The dog's body twitched slightly. Whether from pain or fear, Nathan wasn't sure. Its fur, once possibly thick and beautiful, was now matted with dirt and dried blood. Flies buzzed around the raw wound on its neck, and Nathan clenched his jaw at the sight. "Just hold on, buddy," he muttered, pushing the accelerator a little harder. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. He ignored it at first, but after the third ring, he glanced at the screen. Dr. Evelyn Hayes, he exhaled sharply. Of course, she would be awake. She always was. Snatching the phone, he answered, keeping one hand on the wheel. "Hayes and Nathan, what's going on? You never call this late. I need your help." There was a brief silence on the other end, then a shift in her tone. "What happened? I found a dog. Bad shape. Looks like someone tied him up and left him to die." His grip tightened on the wheel. He's barely breathing. Evelyn cursed under her breath. "Where are you?" "About 10 minutes out from your clinic." "I'll be ready." The line went dead. Nathan exhaled, his knuckles white as he kept his foot pressed on the gas. The dog let out a weak, barely audible whimper. Nathan instinctively reached over, hesitating for a moment before resting his hand lightly on the dog's side. He could feel the faint rise and fall of its ribs, slow, too slow. "You're gonna make it," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince the dog or himself. The vet clinic was a small, single-story building on the outskirts of town. It was usually a quiet place, but tonight every light was on. Evelyn was already waiting by the entrance when Nathan pulled up. She was in scrubs, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, eyes sharp with focus. Beside her stood a younger vet tech, a girl Nathan barely recognized. As soon as he stopped the truck, Evelyn was already pulling open the passenger door. "Oh God," she breathed, eyes widening at the sight of the dog. "Yeah," Nathan muttered. "It's bad. Bring him in." Nathan lifted the dog carefully, feeling its body tremble in his arm. It weighed almost nothing. Skin and bones. As soon as they entered the clinic, Evelyn snapped into action. "Lay him here." She gestured toward the metal examination table. Nathan obeyed, placing the dog down as gently as possible. The vet tech, a nervous-looking girl with dark curls, rushed to Evelyn's side. "What do you need?" "4 fluids. Now." The girl darted into the back room as Evelyn examined the wound on the dog's neck. Nathan stood back, arms crossed, watching as she worked. He had seen her like this before. Sharp, efficient, completely in control. It was one of the things he respected about her. She ran a gloved hand over the dog's ribs, her expression darkening. A malnourished, dehydrated. "This dog hasn't eaten in a long time," Nathan exhaled. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his chest tighten. The tech returned with the fluids, and Evelyn wasted no time hooking them up. She adjusted the drip rate before turning her attention back to the wound. "This was deliberate," she muttered. If someone tied this rope tight enough to cut off circulation. She met Nathan's gaze. Someone wanted this dog to suffer. Nathan's jaw clenched. Evelyn carefully began cleaning the wound, her hands steady. The dog let out a small, pitiful whimper, but it was too weak to fight back. "Is he gonna make it?" Nathan asked. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She focused on her work, disinfecting the wound before applying a special antibiotic ointment. Finally, she sighed. "I don't know." Nathan's stomach sank. "He's in bad shape," she admitted. "The dehydration is severe. The wound is infected. And who knows what else he's been through." Nathan swallowed hard. "But you'll try." She met his eyes, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. "I'll try," she said softly. Hours passed. Nathan paced the waiting area while Evelyn and her team worked. He wasn't sure why he stayed. He didn't even know this dog. But something about those eyes, that broken body clinging to life, made it impossible for him to walk away. He thought about the bridge, the tight rope, the way the dog had barely lifted its head. Someone had done that on purpose. And that thought made his blood boil. Eventually, Evelyn stepped out, peeling off her gloves. Nathan immediately straightened. "How is he?" "He's stable. Stable," she said. "For now." Relief flooded him, but Evelyn's expression remained serious. "But that doesn't mean he's out of danger. He's still weak. We need to see how he responds to treatment." Nathan nodded, exhaling. "Can I see him?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. He followed her back to the treatment area. The dog now lay on a soft blanket, an Favre blanket, in fur attached to his thin leg. He was barely conscious, but his breathing was a little steadier. Nathan crouched beside him. "You're a fighter, huh?" The dog didn't respond, but Nathan didn't expect him to. Evelyn crossed her arms. "He needs a name." Nathan blinked. "A what?" "You saved him. You should name him." He looked at the dog, thinking. Then almost instinctively, he said, "Echo." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Echo," she repeated. "I like it." Nathan nodded, watching the dog's slow breathing. He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt responsible for him. And he wasn't going to let Echo down. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and old paper, a strange mix of sterility and forgotten memories. Nathan sat slouched in one of the waiting room chairs, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together as he watched Echo through the glass panel of the treatment room. The dog hadn't moved much since the Forby had been hooked up, but at least he was breathing. That was something. Evelyn stood beside him, arms crossed, exhaustion etched into her face. The clock on the wall read nearly 3 a.m., but neither of them had made a move to leave. "You don't have to stay," Evelyn murmured, breaking the silence. Nathan barely glanced at her. "I know," she sighed, rubbing her temple. "Meant it when I said he's not out of the woods. His body is weak, his immune system is shot, and the infection..." She shook her head. "It's bad, Nathan. Even with antibiotics, there's no guarantee. I get it." His voice was rougher than he intended. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then softened. "You really care, don't you?" Nathan ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know." He looked back at the dog. Maybe, It wasn't like he'd planned on this. He hadn't woken up thinking he'd stumble across a half-dead dog on the side of the road. And yet here he was, stuck in the middle of something that felt far too personal. Evelyn sighed and sat down beside him. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The one that says you're about to do something stupid." Nathan scoffed. "You make it sound like that's a bad thing. Historically speaking." "Yeah." A flicker of amusement passed between them, but it faded quickly. The silence stretched. Evelyn tapped her fingers against her knee, thinking. "You know," she said finally, "if Echo survives, he's going to need a place to stay." Nathan still. He had been expecting this, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. "You could take him," she continued, studying his reaction. Nathan let out a dry laugh. "You think I'd be a good fit?" Evelyn tilted her head. "I think you're stubborn, reckless, and have a bad habit of taking in lost causes." Nathan gave her a sideways glance. "You calling Echo a lost cause? I meant you," she said, smirking slightly. Nathan shook his head, but he couldn't quite suppress the small smile that tugged at the corner of his lips. Still, the idea of keeping Echo, that was something else entirely. "He can't take in a dog," he said finally. "Why not?" He hesitated. "I don't know." He could hear the unspoken words in his own voice. "Because I don't trust myself to take care of someone. Because I screw things up. Because I'm not the kind of guy who gets to keep good things." Evelyn didn't push you. She just nodded, like she understood more than she let on. "Either way," she said, standing up, "you should get some rest. You're not doing him any good if you're running on fumes." Nathan didn't argue, but he didn't move either. He wasn't leaving. Evelyn seemed to sense that, because she just sighed and gave his shoulder a light squeeze before disappearing into the back. For a long while, Nathan just sat there, staring at Echo's fragile body. Then slowly, he stood and walked into the treatment room. Echo barely stirred as Nathan crouched beside him. The thigh bag hung above the table, the slow drip of fluids the only sound in the room. Nathan hesitated before resting his forearm on the table beside the dog's head. "You're a tough little bastard, you know that," he murmured. Echo's ear twitched slightly, and for some reason it made something tighten in Nathan's chest. He let out a slow breath. "I don't know what happened to you," he admitted. "I don't know who hurt you. But I swear, whoever it was, they're not going to get the chance to do it again." Echo didn't move, but his breathing remained steady. Nathan leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "I don't even like dogs," he muttered. That was a lie. He knew it the second he said it, because deep down a part of him already knew he wasn't walking away from this one, not this time. The night passed in a strange haze of exhaustion and quiet determination. Nathan didn't sleep. Not really. He dozed off a few times, chin resting in his palm, but each time he jolted awake at the faintest sound from Echo. He wasn't sure wired. Maybe it was the eerie silence of the clinic, or maybe it was the way Echo's fragile body seemed too still, too breakable. By the time the first hints of dawn crept through the blinds, the Izani maybe was nearly empty. Echo had moved slightly in his sleep, his ribs still rising and falling in shallow breaths, but there was a flicker of something steadier in them, a whisper of life that hadn't been there before. Nathan stretched, his joints popping as he rolled his shoulders. His body ached from the hours of sitting in the same position, but he ignored it. At some point, Evelyn had returned, her scrub slightly wrinkled, her hair tied up in a messy bun. She glanced at him, then at Echo. "He made it through the night," she said softly. Nathan exhaled, only now realizing he'd been holding his breath. "Oh, that's good," he murmured. Evelyn approached the table, checking Echo's foreline and lifting his paw gently. The dog barely reacted, but his eyes fluttered slightly. He's still weak, but his vitals are a little better. She offered Nathan a small, knowing smile. "You helped." Nathan snorted. "I just sat here. Sometimes that's enough." She turned back to Echo, stroking his thin fur absent-mindedly. "You should eat something," she added. "Or at least get some fresh air. You look like hell." Nathan ran a hand through his hair. "Thanks, Doc. Always a confidence booster," Evelyn chuckled. "I'm just saying, Echo isn't the only one who needs taking care of." Nathan glanced at the dog. "Yeah, well, he's the priority." Evelyn studied him for a moment but didn't argue. Nathan eventually forced himself to step outside, though he didn't go far. He just stood in the parking lot, letting the morning air cool his face. The city was waking up. Cars rumbled in the distance. The scent of brewing coffee wafted from a shop down the street. For a brief moment, he considered leaving. Not in a cruel way, not in a dump the dog and never look back way. Just walking away, letting Evelyn handle it. He'd done his part, hadn't he? But when he turned back toward the clinic and saw Echo's motionless form through the glass, something inside him clenched. No, he wasn't leaving. Not this time. By the afternoon, Echo had stirred more than once. It wasn't much, just a slow blink, a faint twitch of his paws, but it was progress. Nathan sat beside him, arms crossed. "I think you're going to pull through, huh?" he murmured. Echo didn't respond, but his ear flicked. Nathan huffed. "Figures. Tough little bastard." Evelyn walked in, holding a small dish of something that smelled downright awful. "What is that?" Nathan grimaced. "A special high-calorie mix," Evelyn replied. "A basically liquid dog food. He needs to get some nutrients in him." She set the dish on the table and dipped her fingers in, bringing them toward Echo's nose. The dog's nostrils twitched, but he didn't move. Evelyn frowned. "Come on, buddy. You gotta eat. You want to see?" She tried again, this time brushing the food against Echo's lips. He barely reacted. Nathan shifted, watching closely. His stomach twisted. "What happens if he doesn't eat?" he asked. Evelyn sighed. "If he won't take it on his own, we might have to use a feeding syringe. But that's stressful for him, and I'd rather not force it." Nathan stared at the frail animal. Something about the whole situation made his chest feel tight. "Come on, Echo. Fight." Without really thinking, he dipped his fingers into the food and brought them to the dog's mouth. "Try it, buddy," he said softly. Echo's nose twitched again. Then, slowly, sluggishly, his tongue flicked out, just barely licking the food off Nathan's fingers. Nathan held his breath. Evelyn's eyes widened slightly. "That's a good sign," she murmured. Nathan didn't move, afraid that any sudden motion would break the spell. He dipped his fingers again, offering another taste. This time, Echo licked more deliberately. It was slow, almost hesitant, but it was something. "A good boy," Nathan muttered. "Keep going." Little by little, Echo ate. Not much, just tiny licks, but it was enough to make Evelyn look hopeful. Nathan didn't know why, but the sight of it, the tiny fight still left in the dog, made his throat feel tight. Maybe it was stupid, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like something actually depended on him. And he wasn't about to let it down. The tiny victory of Echo licking food from Nathan's fingers should have felt like a turning point, but in reality, it was just the first step in what was shaping up to be a long, uphill battle. The dog was still weak, too weak to lift his head, too weak to even properly lap at the food. Every small movement seemed to drain him, his body trembling from the effort. Evelyn kept her face neutral, but Nathan had spent enough time around her to pick up on the little things, the slight furrow in her brow, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the dish. She wasn't sure if Echo would make it. Neither was Nathan, but he wasn't going to give up on the dog. Not now. Hours passed. Nathan fed Echo in tiny increments, each slow lick a small battle one. The food smelled disgusting, but he didn't care. It was fuel. Fuel that Echo needed if he was going to make it through the night. Evelyn had insisted on taking turns, but Nathan barely moved from his spot. He only left once, long enough to grab a stale gas station sandwich and some coffee, then came right back. By evening, Echo's eyes were staying open longer, flickering between exhaustion and something else. Awareness. Nathan watched him carefully, fingers resting on the edge of the table. "You in there, buddy?" Echo's ears twitched. It wasn't much, but it was the most movement Nathan had seen all day. "He's responding," Evelyn murmured, stepping up beside him. Nathan didn't look away from the dog. "Is that good?" "It's not bad." That wasn't the most reassuring answer, but he'd take it. Evelyn sighed, rubbing her eyes. "We'll need to keep him on fluids for a while longer." His organs took a serious hit from dehydration. He's still at risk for organ failure. Nathan's stomach tightened. "And if that happens?" Evelyn hesitated. "We'd have to make a decision." Nathan understood what she meant. He didn't like it. The clinic closed late in the evening, but Nathan didn't leave. Evelyn had given up trying to get him to go home. Instead, she grabbed a pillow and blanket from the back room and tossed them onto the couch in the waiting area. "If you're staying, at least try to get some sleep," she said. Nathan grunted in response, not moving from his spot beside Echo's table. Evelyn shook her head, muttering something under her breath, but she didn't push him further. Time blurred. The clinic lights dimmed, the quiet hum of machines filling the space. Echo's breathing remained shallow but steady. Nathan sat with his arms crossed, watching, waiting. At some point, exhaustion caught up with him. He slumped forward, head resting on his arms. He didn't mean to fall asleep, but he did. And when he woke up, Echo was gone. Panic surged through him so fast it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. Nathan shot to his feet, eyes darting around the room. The Vissoy stand was still there. The blanket Evelyn had draped over Echo was crumpled on the table. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. But the dog was missing. Nathan's heart hammered. Echo? Silence, then a faint rustling near the exam room doorway. Nathan spun around just in time to see a small, unsteady figure collapse against the floor. The dog had somehow managed to get off the table, but he was barely standing, his legs trembling so badly that they gave out beneath him almost immediately. Nathan was beside him in seconds. Jesus, what the hell are you doing? He crouched, hands hovering, unsure whether to touch him or let him be. Echo was panting, his ribs moving fast and shallow, but his eyes were looking at Nathan. Not dazed, not half dead, focused. Something thick lodged in Nathan's throat. You stubborn little. He cut himself off, exhaling sharply. Carefully, he slipped his hands under Echo's frail body and lifted him. The dog didn't resist. He was too weak. But his head turned slightly, nose pressing against Nathan's arm. Nathan froze. It wasn't much, just the faintest touch, the smallest movement. But it was enough to make his chest tighten painfully. Echo wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting, and Nathan was going to fight with him. Nathan barely breathed as he cradled Echo's frail body, his heart hammering against his ribs. The dog was still as light as a bundle of bones, barely strong enough to hold his head up. But something in his eyes had changed. There was a flicker of awareness of will. He wasn't giving up. And neither was Nathan. Evelyn came rushing in at the sound of movement, her hair still messy from sleep. She stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. Nathan kneeling on the floor, Echo trembling in his arms. Her breath hitched. He moved? Nathan nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. Yeah, he got off the table by himself. Evelyn's eyes widened, the exhaustion in them replaced with something else. Hope. She moved closer, kneeling beside them. Her hands hovered over Echo's body, checking, assessing. His vitals are still weak, but this is Big Nathan. He's responding to you. Nathan swallowed. He already knew that. He had felt it in the way Echo had nudged his arm, in the way the dog had struggled to stand, even when his body failed him. He's trying, Nathan murmured. He wants to live. Evelyn gave a small nod. Then we need to make sure he gets the chance. The next few days were a careful balancing act. Echo still couldn't stand for more than a few seconds at a time, but he was trying, and that was enough to keep Nathan going. He barely left the clinic. He stayed through the night, sleeping in a stiff chair beside Echo's recovery area. When Evelyn forced him to take breaks, he only went as far as the waiting room, where he dozed off on the couch with his phone clutched in his hand. Each day he fed Echo in small increments, making sure the dog took in enough nutrients to keep him going, but not too much to overwhelm his fragile system. It was slow, painfully slow, but Echo was fighting. And with every small improvement, Nathan felt himself getting more attached. By the end of the week, Echo managed to lift his head properly. Nathan was sitting on the floor beside the dog's makeshift bed when it happened. He had just finished feeding him when Echo shifted slightly, his front paws pushing against the blanket. Then, with a slow, shaky effort, he raised his head. Nathan sat up straight, barely believing what he was seeing. Whoa, look at you. Echo blinked sluggishly, his ears twitching at the sound of Nathan's voice. Evelyn, who had been checking some paperwork nearby, turned at the noise. When she saw Echo sitting up, she sucked in a breath. Totally. Nathan grinned, running a hand over his face. Yeah. They watched as Echo tried to shift forward, his paws pressing weakly against the blanket. His legs still trembled, but there was a determination in his movements, a quiet, stubborn will to keep going. Evelyn knelt beside them, her voice soft. Were you a miracle, you know that? Echo didn't respond. He was already exhausted from the effort. But as his head lowered back onto the blanket, his eyes remained open, watching them. Nathan exhaled slowly. They weren't just keeping Echo alive anymore. He was coming back to life. The quiet hum of the clinic was broken only by the soft rustling of Echo's blanket as he shifted, testing the strength in his limbs. Nathan sat beside him, his fingers lightly brushing the dog's matted fur. The weight of exhaustion clung to him, but he didn't care. Every second with Echo felt like a small victory. Evelyn leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching with quiet intensity. "He's improving," she murmured. "Slowly, but he is." Nathan nodded, his gaze locked on Echo. "He's trying harder than anyone I've ever seen." It was true. Every day, Echo pushed himself a little more, even when his body barely had the strength to respond. The tremors in his legs were still there, but they weren't as violent. His ribs were still visible, but there was a tiny hint of muscle forming under his fur. And his eyes, those golden, haunted eyes, weren't so hollow anymore. That evening, Nathan sat cross-legged on the floor, holding a shallow dish of water in front of Echo. "All right, buddy, let's see if you can drink on your own." Echo had been taking water through a syringe for days, too weak to lap it up himself. But now, with his head steady and his body a little stronger, Nathan wanted to see if he could do it. The dog stared at the water, then at Nathan. There was hesitation in his gaze, like he wasn't sure if he was capable of this. Nathan smiled softly. "You can do this." Slowly, carefully, Echo stretched his neck forward, his nose dipped toward the dish, his tongue flicking out to test the surface. Then, after a moment, he drank. It was clumsy at first, his tongue struggling to coordinate the movement, but once he got the hang of it, he drank with quiet determination. Nathan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Evelyn, who had been watching from the doorway, let out a small laugh. "Oh well, I'll be damned." Nathan looked up at her, grinning. "He's stubborn, just needed to be reminded how to do it." Echo finished drinking and slowly lifted his head, licking his nose. His ears twitched slightly at the sound of Nathan's voice, and for the first time, instead of looking away or shutting down, he held Nathan's gaze. It was only for a few seconds, but it was something. Nathan swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. "Yeah, buddy, you're doing good." Echo blinked slowly, then, to Nathan's complete shock, his tail gave a weak but deliberate wag. Nathan froze. It was barely anything, a tiny twitch of movement, but it was there. Evelyn gasped. Did he just... "Yeah," Nathan whispered. He reached out instinctively, his fingers grazing Echo's fur. The dog didn't flinch away this time. He just lay there, watching him with quiet curiosity. Nathan exhaled slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're coming back to me, aren't you?" Echo didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Nathan already knew, to be continued. The morning sunlight filtered through the clinic's windows, casting golden streaks across the floor. Nathan sat beside Echo's bed, his back resting against the wall, watching as the dog shifted slightly in his blanket. Echo had been improving, slowly, steadily, but today was an important test. Nathan had a leash in his hands. Evelyn stood nearby, arms crossed, watching carefully. "You really think he's ready?" Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but we won't know unless we try." It had been nearly a week since Echo had arrived at the clinic. He was stronger now, still frail, still unsteady, but stronger. His eyes no longer held the empty hollowness they once did. He recognized Nathan now, at least enough that he no longer recoiled when he moved too fast or spoke too loudly. But trust was a slow road. Nathan reached out, leash in one hand, the other resting lightly on Echo's paw. The dog tensed slightly but didn't pull away. That was progress. "Hey, buddy," Nathan murmured. "Let's try something new today, yeah?" Echo's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Nathan moved slowly, carefully looping the soft leash over Echo's neck. The dog stiffened, his body coiling like a spring, but he didn't panic. "Not yet." "You're okay," Nathan whispered. "It's just me." For a moment, Echo didn't move. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his mind clearly at war with itself. Then finally, he let Nathan clip the leash in place. Nathan let out a slow breath of relief. "A good boy," he murmured. "You're doing good." Evelyn, who had been holding her own breath, finally exhaled. "That's a miracle right there." Nathan smiled faintly. "Yeah, but we're not done yet." The clinic had a small enclosed backyard, nothing fancy, just a patch of grass and a few benches. But for Echo, it was the outside world. Nathan opened the back door, stepping out first. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh leaves. Echo stood frozen at the threshold, his body tense. Nathan knelt beside him, giving the leash a gentle tug. "Come on, buddy, just a step." Echo hesitated. His eyes darted between Nathan and the open yard. Nathan could almost see the memories flashing behind those golden eyes. The fear, the pain, the uncertainty. But then Echo took a step forward, then another, and another. Nathan kept his movements slow, patient. He didn't pull or force. He just walked beside him, letting Echo find his own courage. For the first time in what must have been months, Echo felt the grass beneath his paws. Nathan knelt beside him, his voice soft. "You see, not so bad." Echo sniffed the air cautiously. The outside world was overwhelming, so many scents, so many sounds. But instead of panicking, he simply stood there, taking it in. And then in the smallest, most hesitant movement, his tail wagged. Nathan felt something tighten in his chest. He reached out, fingers brushing against Echo's fur. "You're doing amazing," he whispered. Echo still flinched at sudden movements, still hesitated when Nathan reached for him. But this time, he didn't pull away, and for now, that was enough. The first step outside had been a victory, but the road to healing was still long. Echo had spent years in the shadows, forgotten, abandoned, left to fend for himself. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to stay on guard. Yet here he was, standing in the backyard of the clinic, feeling the earth beneath his paws in a world that no longer felt like a battlefield. Nathan sat on the grass a few feet away, careful not to crowd him. The leash rested loosely in his hands, but he didn't pull. He didn't push. Echo looked at him, ears twitching, eyes uncertain. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," Nathan said softly. Echo sniffed at the ground, his body tense. Then cautiously he took another step. Nathan remained still, watching as Echo slowly, carefully began to explore. His steps were hesitant, his movements stiff, but there was something in his posture that Nathan hadn't seen before. Curiosity. It was small, but it was there. Evelyn watched from the doorway, arms crossed. He's coming out of his shell. Nathan nodded, keeping his eyes on Echo. A little. Echo turned his head at the sound of their voices, his ears flicking backward. Then, after a moment, he continued walking. Nathan smiled. This was progress. After a few minutes, Echo's movements slowed. He was getting tired. Nathan could see it in the way his legs trembled slightly, how his breaths came a little faster. "All right, buddy," he murmured, gently tugging the leash. "Let's get you back inside." Echo hesitated. Nathan held his breath. If Echo resisted, forcing him would undo all their progress. But then, slowly, Echo followed. Each step was careful, but he didn't fight it. He let Nathan guide him back toward the door, back to the safety of the clinic. Evelyn moved aside as they entered. "That's more than I thought he'd do." Nathan crouched beside Echo, unclipping the leash. The dog stood still, processing everything. Then, to Nathan's quiet amazement, Echo leaned against him. Not much, just the faintest bit of pressure, but it was enough. Nathan swallowed the lump in his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. A good boy. Echo didn't flinch this time. That night, Nathan stayed late at the clinic, sitting beside Echo's bed. He didn't talk much. He just sat there, letting the dog get used to his presence. After an hour, Echo let out a long sigh and curled up, his head resting on Nathan's leg. Nathan barely dared to move. But as he looked down at the broken creature, slowly learning to trust again, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't giving up on him. Not now, not ever. The clinic was quiet that night, the only sounds being the distant hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of Echo shifting in his sleep. Nathan didn't leave. He sat there for hours, his back resting against the side of Echo's bed, fingers idly brushing against the dog's thick fur. Each breath Echo took was deep and steady, a stark contrast to the panicked, shallow gasps that had once defined his every moment. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The next morning, Evelyn walked into the room with a cup of coffee in one hand and an amused expression. "You planning to move anytime soon?" Nathan blinked awake, realizing he had dozed off sometime in the early hours. His neck ached from the awkward position, but none of that mattered, because Echo was still beside him. And for the first time since they had met, Echo didn't panic when Nathan stirred. Instead, the dog lifted his head sleepily, blinking at him with tired golden eyes before resting his chin back on Nathan's knee. Evelyn's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be damned." Nathan smiled. "Yeah, Evelyn sipped her coffee, nodding toward Echo. He's starting to trust you." Nathan reached down, brushing his fingers lightly over Echo's ear. The dog didn't flinch. "I think so," he murmured. The next few days were filled with small victories. Echo was eating more. His posture was a little less guarded. And most importantly, he had stopped growling whenever Nathan entered the room. Trust wasn't something that could be forced. It had to be earned. And Nathan was willing to take whatever time was necessary. They kept up their outdoor sessions, each one lasting a little longer. At first, Echo would barely step beyond the threshold of the door. His body tensed as if waiting for something to go wrong. But as the days passed, he grew braver. One afternoon, as they stood in the backyard, Echo did something that nearly brought tears to Nathan's eyes. He wagged his tail. It was faint, barely noticeable. But it was there, a slow, hesitant motion, as if he himself wasn't sure he was allowed to feel happiness. Nathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A good boy. Echo turned his head slightly, his ears flicking. For the first time, he looked at Nathan without fear. That night, as Nathan sat beside Echo's bed, he reached out a hand slowly. Echo watched him, his muscles tensed for half a second, then just as quickly relaxed. Nathan's fingers brushed against his fur, just a light touch. Echo didn't pull away. Instead, with a deep breath, he leaned into it. It was the first time Echo had willingly sought out comfort. And in that moment, Nathan knew this dog wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning to live. The days blurred into a quiet, steady rhythm. Nathan and Echo found themselves slipping into an unspoken routine. Morning walks in the backyard, careful feeding sessions, and long evenings spent sitting side by side. There was no rush, no pressure, just time and an unbreakable patience that Nathan knew Echo had never experienced before. One morning, Evelyn watched from the doorway as Nathan carefully knelt beside Echo, waiting. "You ever thought about keeping him?" she asked casually. Instead, he extended his hand, palm up in front of Echo's face. The dog sniffed it briefly before lowering his head, resting his muzzle lightly against Nathan's fingers. A voluntary touch. Nathan felt something tighten in his chest. "I have," he admitted. Evelyn sipped her coffee, her eyes glimmering with something close to amusement. "He's already chosen you, you know." Nathan looked at Echo, really looked at him. The scars were still there, marking his body like a map of his past struggles, but his eyes, those deep golden pools, were softer now. Less afraid, less lost. Nathan smiled. "Yeah, I think I've chosen him too." That afternoon, something remarkable happened. Nathan had taken Echo outside again, guiding him to the farthest edge of the backyard, the place that had once been too intimidating for the dog to step near. But today was different. Echo stood beside Nathan, his paws pressing into the damp earth. His ears twitched, his nose lifted to the wind, and for a long moment he simply existed, free. And then the most unexpected thing happened. Echo ran. It wasn't a full sprint, not yet. But it was more than Nathan had ever seen. A slow, tentative trot, his tail raised ever so slightly, his body no longer curled inward in self-defense. Nathan barely breathed, afraid that any sudden movement would break the spell. Echo stopped a few feet away, turning back toward him. His eyes were bright. And then, for the first time, he barked. Not in fear, not in aggression, but in something close to joy. Nathan let out a breathless laugh. "That's it, buddy." And when he crouched down and held out his arms, Echo ran back to him. That night, as Nathan sat beside the dog's bed, something changed. Echo didn't just tolerate Nathan's presence anymore. He sought it out. With a quiet huff, Echo crawled onto Nathan's lap, something he had never done before. Nathan froze, his heart pounding. Echo curled up, his weight warm and solid against him. His breathing slowed, steady, trusting. Nathan swallowed hard. This wasn't just progress, this was a beginning. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the evening. Nathan sat frozen, barely daring to breathe as Echo remained curled up in his lap, his weight warm and solid. For months they had inched toward this moment, step by careful step. Echo had tolerated his presence, accepted his food, walked beside him. But this was different. This was trust. Nathan slowly, gently rested his hand against Echo's back. The dog didn't flinch, didn't move away. Instead, Echo exhaled a soft sound of contentment. Nathan blinked hard, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He had never forced Echo to accept him, had never demanded affection. And yet, somehow, in his own time, in his own way, Echo had chosen him. Over the next few days, things shifted. The house felt different now. Echo still had his moments of hesitation, times when a sudden movement made him freeze, when an unexpected sound sent him retreating to his safe spot. But those moments became fewer, less absolute. And then, one morning, something unbelievable happened. Nathan was at the kitchen counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee, when he felt it, a nudge, a cold, wet nose against his hand. Nathan turned, startled. Echo stood there, his head tilted, his golden eyes steady. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a mistake. For the first time ever, Echo had come to him. Nathan barely managed to whisper, "Hey, buddy." Slowly, cautiously, he crouched down, holding his hand out in offering. Echo leaned into it. Nathan felt his throat tighten. "You're really doing this, huh?" he murmured, stroking the dog's ears. "You're letting me in." Echo let out a quiet huff, almost as if in agreement. It was such a small thing. But to Nathan, it meant everything. That evening, Evelyn stopped by with a bag of dog treats and a knowing smile. "You're looking at him differently," she observed as Nathan sat on the floor beside Echo, running his fingers through the dog's thick fur. Nathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced down at Echo, who was resting his head on Nathan's knee, a position of comfort, not just tolerance. "He's mine," Nathan said quietly. The realization hit him like a weight, but not a burden, something solid, something that felt right. Evelyn grinned. "It took you long enough to admit it." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. But as he looked at Echo, truly looked at him, he knew. This dog wasn't just a responsibility. He wasn't just a project, a creature to be rehabilitated and set free. Echo was his family, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Nathan knew he had been chosen too. The following days settled into a rhythm, one neither Nathan nor Echo had expected but somehow felt natural. Mornings were quiet, filled with the steady sound of paws against hardwood floors as Echo followed Nathan from room to room. He never asked for attention, never begged for treats, just existed beside him, content in the knowledge that he was safe. Nathan had spent months waiting, hoping that Echo would one day seek him out. But now that it was happening, he found himself marveling at just how much it meant. Even the little things, like the way Echo's ears perked up when Nathan spoke, or how he lingered just a second longer when Nathan ran a hand through his fur, felt like victories. Hard-earned, impossible to fake trust. And yet, some nights Nathan still found Echo curled up in his usual corner, staring at the world with those haunted eyes. The past still had a hold on him. And Nathan knew some wounds never fully healed. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the window panes, Nathan found himself watching Echo from across the room. The dog was curled on the couch, a place he had once avoided like it was dangerous. Now it was his. Nathan smiled to himself before getting up, grabbing his jacket. "I'll be back in a bit, buddy," he murmured, even though he doubted Echo would follow. But when he turned toward the door, he heard the soft sound of nails clicking on the floor. Echo was right there. Nathan paused, looking down at him. "You want to come?" He asked, knowing full well that before, Echo would have shrunk back at the idea of going outside at night, but the dog stood firm. His golden eyes didn't waver. For the first time, he wanted to go. Nathan swallowed thickly, then nodded. "All right, let's go then." The night air was crisp and damp, the scent of rain still lingering in the wind. Nathan shoved his hands into his pockets as he walked down the familiar path leading toward the wooded trail behind the house. Echo stayed close, not out of fear. Nathan glanced at him. "You remember this place, don't you?" Echo's ears flicked, but he didn't react much. Nathan knew better than to expect an answer. They walked in silence for a while. Nathan let the cool air clear his thoughts, feeling the weight of Echo's quiet presence beside him. When they reached the clearing, Nathan stopped, looking up at the dark sky, the faint glow of the moon peeking through the drifting clouds. Echo sat beside him. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't filled with tension or uncertainty, it was understanding. Nathan let out a slow breath. "You've come a long way, you know." Echo didn't move. But Nathan saw the slight way his tail curled around his paws, a small, silent acknowledgement. Nathan crouched beside him, running his fingers gently over Echo's thick fur. He didn't say much, it didn't need to, because in that moment under the moonlit sky, with the dog who had once been a shadow of himself sitting calmly at his side, Nathan knew. They didn't need words. This was a promise. Nathan hadn't realized just how much had changed until he saw Echo sleeping peacefully in the living room, his body stretched across the couch as if he had belonged there all along. There was no flinching at shadows, no restless pacing in the dark, no nervous twitching at the slightest sound. Echo had settled. It was strange to think back to how things had been when they first met, how the dog had been nothing more than a scarred ghost, barely able to exist in the same space as another living being. But now, Echo was here. Not just in the house, not just surviving, but living. Nathan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he sat down beside him. His fingers absent-mindedly found their way to Echo's thick fur, scratching behind his ears. The dog stirred but didn't pull away. That small trust still sent a warmth through Nathan's chest. They had come so far. But there was still one final step Echo had yet to take, going beyond the safety of the house. Nathan had been patient, never forcing the idea of long walks or car rides. The last time Echo had been inside a car, it had been to escape the place where he had suffered for so long. Nathan wasn't sure if that memory still clung to him, but tonight he would find out. Nathan jingled his keys, watching as Echo lifted his head slightly. "You up for a little drive?" Echo didn't tense at the sound, didn't sink into himself like before. Instead, he just watched, his golden eyes calm. Nathan stood by the door, waiting. He wasn't going to coax him, wasn't going to beg. Echo had to choose this. A long moment passed. Then, to Nathan's quiet amazement, Echo moved. Slowly, cautiously, he padded toward the door, not fearfully, but with determination. Nathan opened the door, the cool night air sweeping in. Echo stepped forward, his nose twitching at the fresh scents drifting in from the trees. And then he turned to Nathan, a silent question. Nathan gave a small smile. "Let's go." The truck was old, the seats worn from years of use, but the moment Echo climbed in, Nathan could tell this wasn't the same as before. He didn't shake, didn't freeze up, didn't brace for something bad. He simply settled onto the seat, his ears twitching slightly as the engine rumbled to life. Nathan pulled out of the driveway, keeping his movements smooth, steady. He wasn't going far, just a short drive to the open fields past the hill. A place where Echo could feel the wind, see the stars without the heavy weight of walls around him. They drove in silence, the dark road stretching ahead of them. The occasional glow of passing streetlights washed over Echo's fur, casting long shadows, and then Nathan saw it, the moment of change. Echo turned his head toward the open window, his nose lifting slightly, and for the first time, he closed his eyes. Not out of fear, not to escape, but to feel. The wind ruffled his fur, carrying scents that weren't tainted with memories of pain or loneliness. The night was alive with possibilities, with freedom. Nathan swallowed, his hands gripping the wheel just a little tighter. This was what he had been waiting for. Not Echo learning to sit on command. Not Echo eating without hesitation. Not even Echo lying beside him without fear. But this moment, this quiet, beautiful moment where Echo finally allowed himself to just be. Nathan didn't say anything. He just drove, letting the road stretch out before them, endless and full of promise. The old truck rolled to a stop at the edge of the open fields. The engine hummed quietly before Nathan shut it off, letting silence settle over them. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the grass, the distant call of crickets in the night. Then Echo shifted. Slowly, cautiously, he lifted his head, his ears twitching as he took in the quiet surroundings. Nathan waited. No commands, no expectations. This was Echo's moment. The dog turned his gaze toward the door. Then, before Nathan could even move to help, he stepped forward. His front paws touched the ground first, then his back legs followed, his movements smooth, confident. Nathan exhaled, hardly realizing he'd been holding his breath. Echo stood there, his nose lifted to the cool night air, breathing in the world around him. And then, in a moment that nearly brought tears to Nathan's eyes, Echo took a step forward, then another, then another. Not hesitant, not fearful, but free. Nathan followed at a distance, watching as Echo wandered through the tall grass, his tail swaying ever so slightly. For so long, Echo had been trapped. By his past, by his fears, by the invisible chains of a life that had taught him only pain. But now he was something else entirely. He was more. He was whole. Nathan sat down on the truck's tailgate, just watching. He didn't need to call for Echo. Didn't need to lure him back with treats or reassurance, because Echo would come back. Not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because he chose to. And sure enough, after a few minutes of wandering, of being, Echo turned. Their eyes met across the dark field, and in that moment, Nathan knew he had done it. He had saved him, not just in the way of shelter and food, not just in bandaging wounds or offering safety, but truly, completely saved him. Echo started trotting back, his steps sure and steady. And as he reached Nathan, something incredible happened. Echo leaned into him, not just stood beside him, but pressed against him, his warmth solid, real. Nathan blinked hard against the sting in his eyes. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He just sat there, running his fingers through Echo's thick fur as the stars stretched overhead and the wind carried away the last remnants of the past. They were here, they were whole. And for the first time in Echo's life, he was finally home. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, imagine the countless other incredible journeys waiting for you. Every story we share is filled with emotion, mystery, and unforgettable moments, and we don't want you to miss a single one. Hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to experience our next thrilling tale. Join us on this journey because some stories stay with you forever. Subscribe now.